So, obviously, the evidence of climate change is upon us. There's no question about that. We talked about hurricanes, storms, appropriate adaptation. So, woodland owners tend to be very concerned and or curious about how their forest land will be impacted and what adaptations they can make to help in the future. We've saved this important topic for the end of the day, as Craig Tupper will address it. Craig holds a BSc in Forestry from the University of New Brunswick, is a registered professional forester in Nova Scotia, and has worked in several roles across government, industry, and private woodlot stewardship for close to 2 decades. Is that possible, Craig? I still think he was being our young student. Time has flown by. Jim, you can relax now. Make yourself comfortable. So, including most recently forest harvesting, planning, and landowner engagement. He's been deeply involved in many advocacy, landowner, and professional organizations throughout his forestry career so far in the sector. Craig is a connoisseur of maple syrup, which I'm well aware. He's an avid gardener, a woodworker, outdoors person, loves his Jeep, and a hunter of edible fungi. Joined the forest program team at the Community Forest International just over a year ago. And many of you will know him from his former employment at Athol Forestry. He was the face of Athol Forestry, and we worked very well together over the years. So he's joined the team at Community Forest International just over a year ago to help foster and adapt forestry practices to a changing climate and stewardship paradigm. Craig and his family reside in southeast New Brunswick and are caretakers of 120 acres of mixed Wabanaki forest in northern Nova Scotia. The title of Craig's presentation today is Climate Adaptive Silviculture Techniques for Private Forest Caretakers. Craig, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Thanks, Don. I know about 1.5 years ago, I probably told several of you in the room that I wasn't running too far away, and I hope that that rings true today, that I'll get to come back and talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing in that new role. I am now the Forest Program Manager at Community Forest International. I get to work with a wonderful team of dedicated and caring people that are hopefully trying to bring part of the solution to climate adaptation in the Wabanaki Forest. And I say the Wabanaki Forest because we are very incredibly passionate about incorporating Indigenous concerns and values within every aspect of our work. We're working alongside with land trusts as well as Indigenous communities and many different aspects of our land conservation work. We hold approximately 5,500 acres of forest land across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and that land is mostly mixed-use forest, formerly purchased from private caretakers like yourselves, and we manage it for both biodiversity, old forest conservation, as well as climate adaptation. It's a bit of a living laboratory, if you will, because a lot of the land that we do conserve is younger forests that have been degraded, forests that have been worked hard over their lifetime. So we purchase both lands that have been harvested and work through the 2 Billion Trees program, which includes probably one of the largest contributions in Eastern Canada to that program. And I'll just click on that next slide here. Once I find the button.
Point toward the left,
Oh, there we go. And we have a strong storytelling component to our work as well. I'd encourage any of you to go on to our website and YouTube channel, which we'll have the links to at the end for you to look at, as it has a lot of resources for forest caretakers like yourselves to learn a bit about forest adaptation and stuff. And I feel really privileged too that I get to speak to you at the end of the day after hearing from great speakers like James Steenberg on climate adaptation, and even some of the work like the Association for Sustainable Forestry is doing with regards to Fiona cleanup and things like that, because we know in this area it had a massive impact on your forests. And part of what we do going forward is going to be learning how to adapt our practices to prevent those sorts of events happening in the future with such intensity and damaging effects. And of course, I can't stress enough that we also work in the forest carbon economy, because you've heard from two or at least a couple other groups here in the room today that are working on developing that, including the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust, as well as Growing Forests, which is another organization headed up by Dale Press that's also working in forest carbon economy. And we have our own forest carbon pilot across the Maritimes that has incorporated about 70,000 acres of land and several forest caretakers across the region, and that's ongoing. Like James alluded to, that market has been a very long time coming, and it still feels maybe a little bit elusive, but certainly judging by the people in the room today, it's really encouraging to see that it's that much closer to being a reality, because we believe that when people are able to engage with and work with their forests, that we can be that restorative force for biodiversity, for ecology, for carbon storage, for that climate solution. So, probably for the last decade, I've known Community Forests International through a pile of contacts and friends, including Dale over there in the corner, and I promise I'm going to stop fingering you at some point here. But he's encouraged me several times to come and visit Woodland Forest in the Sussex area, which was one of the first conservation forests that Community Forests International secured in 2012. It was approximately 550 acres at the time, and it's expanded over the years through a couple of other securements. And it is really quite an amazing forest. It's a mixture of tolerant hardwood and softwood, as well as some farmland and regenerating pasture. It was secured under the first forest carbon project on privately held lands in eastern Canada, and it was a massive undertaking. But because of that forest carbon offset work that we've done there, we then have to be very careful about how we manage that forest to maintain forest carbon stocks on the land base. And as you've heard from James in the past little bit, we know that certain forest types are more at risk than others, and some species are more at risk than others in the changing climate. And we therefore have to consider some of the more at-risk areas in these forests for restoration type treatments and for enhancing their ability to store durable carbon over the long term. And I'll tell you too, one of my first, what really resonated earlier today too with Lacey and Elizabeth's presentation was their mention of being able to connect with a forest and then plant. And about 1.5 years ago when I joined CFI, I finally got the opportunity to go and see this forest that I've been told about for a decade now. And it was every bit as impressive as I was led to believe. So I got to walk in through some of the trails and walk up into some of the old hemlock stands. Early December, just had very light snow, but I was still in a sweater and managed to do the 7-kilometer loop trail early in the morning before anyone else showed up. You've got, hemlock stands that are pure hemlock that are probably in the 80 to 90-year-old range. They're not old growth by any stretch, but they are really amazing forests on some pretty steep topography. That grades then into sugar maple and red oak stand right at the top of the ridge. and the trail kind of dives back down into 60 and 70-year-old old pasture land. Barbed wire fences are still evident, but in amongst that pasture, you've got balsam fir predominantly, but you've also got things like black cherry, you've got things like trembling aspen and other early successional species, but also red maple, white pine, huge white pine in these stands because they were open grown for so long, of course. You've also got things like red spruce and yellow birch, typical traditional Acadian forest species that we think of. So you've heard a lot of this kind of in the earlier presentations around climate adaptation and carbon storage from James, who did a lovely job on that. We know that the Wabanaki Forest region is naturally fire resistant in its unaltered state. It's very carbon dense. So we know that it is driven primarily by wind and insect natural disturbance. I know Peter's going to shoot me, Peter Bush is going to shoot me for saying it's less than 5% remaining in pre-colonial condition. That's a very old number based on one paper in the literature back in 2004. So really the best answer to that is we don't know how much old forest is out there currently. But it's not a lot. And a lot of that work all ties into nature-based climate solutions. And if I asked you what a nature-based climate solution was, how many people in here could define that for me? Just raise your hand. I'm not going to ask at this point in the day. All right, we got a couple. Nature-based climate solutions are one of the ways that we can help solve part of the climate crisis. And if I told you that in this room, you people probably hold one of the keys to the best nature-based climate solutions in the region, and that is your forests, because they have such a tremendous capacity to draw down carbon, and because they're naturally resilient when they're in that diverse state with multiple age classes, with species diversity, with different levels of impact over the landscape. So when I say that, we've heard from a diverse group of people and backgrounds in here talking about different approaches to forestry. No one approach to forestry is going to solve that issue, that it's going to take multiple approaches, and I'm just going to tell you about one approach that we did today. Most of you are going to be very familiar with this image. This one was a single tree selection harvest that I had overseen in 2019. It was on a lowland farming plain. It was probably old pasture at one time, regenerated in mostly red spruce and white pine. It was fairly exposed, but I left a buffer on the upper edge of it, much as I appreciated Stephen McClellan's presentation because he did bring up some really great, considerations around the harvest that he's used in the past to mitigate against wind throw. And that was employed here, but we also know from the literature and research that sustained winds over 95 kilometers an hour and gusts over about 150 kilometers an hour are going to result in significant loss no matter what you do with that forest stand. But when you're lower than that threshold, we can use several different approaches to mitigate the impacts of wind on those stands. After Hurricane Juan, the department came out with several research papers on wind throw after that. Most of those indicated that if you remove more than 30 to 40% of your standing trees, and you are going to experience significant loss in those stands. So what we're advocating for in this approach is going to be lighter removal rates, and that includes your trail removals, which some other documents don't incorporate in their recommendations. So the removal rates really should be below that threshold in order to minimize the amount of wind damage. We know in several of those research papers, Anthony Taylor wrote a really good one here a couple of years ago, also based on Hurricane 1, that indicated that stand structure was one of the most important considerations in the resilience of a forest stand to disturbance, not necessarily exposure even. So while you're looking at this photo, I want you to keep in mind also, not just what's blown down, but what's standing around it and what pattern you're looking at there. Because you're going to see it again. When you look here, you can also see that, yes, there are some damaged standing trees. There's some leaning trees, but there's also trees standing within that gap, and you can see a very distinctive gap in that wind pattern where you've got retained trees in that. So we're going to talk about some strategies for mitigating climate risk and increasing carbon storage of your forests. And many of these you've heard already, but creating complex, uneven-aged forests are one way of mitigating the risk of climate change impacts. Increasing species and age diversity and increasing the movement of biomass in your forest into different carbon pools, because we've heard about those carbon pools from James in his presentation. We've got the deadwood pool, the standing live trees, and soil carbon as well. And one of the big things that we're missing on a lot of the working landscape, and perhaps this doesn't ring quite as resoundingly as it might have 6 months ago, but deadwood within our working forests. Oftentimes we have the urge to remove as much as we can. And when we're doing even uneven age treatments, we don't want to waste what's in that forest, and we have to consider perhaps what other values that deadwood is within the forest. So increasing the capacity of forests to have long-term carbon in deadwood by leaving standing dead trees and also recruiting trees into that pool over the long term for biodiversity reasons, but also for carbon storage and for cycling that carbon into your forest soils. We also know that designating those permanent reserves and stuff also will provide shade, future wildlife trees, and nurse trees or seed trees as well for your natural regeneration within some of these treatments and stands. And also, you've seen that species list that highlights species that are going to be resilient in the long term, and I'd encourage you to retain examples of those throughout your woodlot. Protecting soil integrity. Soil, as we've heard before, contains up to 40% or more of the carbon in your woodlot. And when we remove an entire overstory, we expose that soil to desiccation, to wind and rain, and all of that is going to start the decomposition process and release a lot more of that soil carbon than we probably expect. And it takes a really long time for that to recover. And speaking here in Nova Scotia, embracing the ecological function as the primary measure of forest health, as was advocated in the Lady report. is going to allow us to, I guess, reimagine our relationship with our forests and also retain a lot of that productivity over the long term. Another thing that I like that Stephen McClellan mentioned in his presentation was maintaining higher tree densities than ideal, because sometimes that's a valid strategy both for carbon storage as well as timber value and wind resistance. So natural disturbance-based silviculture is, you know, when you step outside of maybe traditional management circles, this is going to be the buzzword or the buzz phrase for a lot of research into silviculture and into climate resilience. The example that we have is back at Weldon Brand Farm. And there are a couple examples here in Cumberland County that I had undertaken over the last couple of years as well that are very similar in nature, but maybe not perfectly aligned with the values of carbon storage. But it was mostly a regeneration treatment in that case. At Waldenbrand, we decided that the highest risk stand in that forest was the balsam fir dominated pasture. It had very low levels of regeneration. It also had low levels of coarse woody debris. It had been impacted by generations of farming activities and grazing. So that 30-hectare stand, we decided we were going to use a high retention, irregular gap shelter wood on it. And you're going to hear that in the SGEM document here in Nova Scotia. That is a treatment where gaps are created in the canopy that foster shade-tolerant regeneration. Oftentimes they're recommended for stands that already have a component of shade-tolerant long-lived species. And in that context, it's used mostly for ecological integrity. In this case, it's used also because it retains a lot of carbon on the site over the long term, but still allows you to regenerate the stand and remove those species that are high risk, like the balsam fir. So this stand was 60 years old. I believe our pre-treatment data in there, we did a Nova Scotia pre-treatment assessment because it's very fortunate here in Nova Scotia to have so many resources available to you that allow you to do this sort of work, including supportive silviculture funding arrangements with several partners like the Association for Sustainable Forestry and the Family Forest Network, and as well as some industry partners supporting those sorts of treatments as well. So though this 60-year-old stand had minor components of maple, pine, oak, like I say, black cherry, all sorts of things. The oak stand at the top of the hill is probably my favorite stand because it's going to allow us to regenerate oak in the stands below it because it's just seeding right down. It's doing quite well in that respect. There's already all kinds of regeneration within these stands. And I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, but even just traveling around Cumberland in the last number of years, it might just be the way that I'm looking at things now too, but I see a lot more oak regeneration around Cumberland County when I'm traveling around in the understory and ditches in the forest as well. Even red, like some planted red pine stands, I'm finding red oak in. My woodlot in Amherst, mostly a black spruce plantation, and there's red oak throughout it. Small 3-leaf red oak coming up everywhere in it. I'm thrilled. So our objectives for this stand were to transition out climate vulnerable species, diversify the stand structure, and retain and promote the improvement of full cycle long-lived trees, but also to operate outside of the primary nesting season. So by saying that, we wanted to time that harvest so that we were not doing it within that April to July window. And it worked out really well. We've also developed this guide, mostly for forest practitioners, but if you want to see a copy of it and look at it, it's available on our website. You can download it in PDF format. But it was developed by my colleague Megan DeGraff and Gareth Davies at the Maritime College of Forest Technology. And it's a decision tree that is very similar to the Silvicultural Guide to the Ecological Matrix, except the priority shifts very ever so slightly towards climate resilience and carbon storage instead of simply ecological function. So with this treatment, we create gaps in the stand that are approximately 20 meters, and they're spaced 60 to 65 meters apart with trails connecting them. And we remove almost all of the overstory within that gap, except for examples of those long-lived species, and hopefully that's 5 to 10 trees in 20-meter gaps. It's really easy to implement. It works well with a lot of different harvesting technology, depending on the site condition, and it's fairly productive. You can work through it very quickly, so it works well with contractors. We don't think outside of the gaps to retain that wind resistance in the stand, and this is basically what it looks like from the bottom of one of these gaps once it's completed. We've got some standing red spruce in here, and this stand was a pretty degraded part of it. It had some white birch, also remnant in the stand, but also some white pine and some regenerating species that were about 2 meters tall. And we left those. The map on the other side, you can see, shows the layout of trails and gaps. It doesn't show super well, but the gaps are along that trail network. And it was a pretty complicated one because there were also an awful lot of water courses in there that we then had to buffer out and avoid as well. Great application for degraded stands and low value stands because it allows you to remove less than 30% of the stand and still regenerate it well. You can also use it in previously managed stands where you're worried about wind throw. And it's really applicable on your woodlot if you've got something compatible that you can use at the same time, say a commercial thinning next door, or a single tree selection in another area of the stand. If it's not regenerating to your satisfaction, enhancement planting in the gaps works as well. And I'd also suggest some type of pending treatment of those gaps at the next entry, because the ideal is that you go back in 20 or 30 years and maintain that 1% per year removal rate and expand the gaps up to 3 to 4 times after that initial treatment. This is a photo from the top of the gap showing the land-urge harvester that we used in this situation. It's a single grip harvester, very common in New Brunswick contexts. The challenges to applying this are going to be contractor and practitioner capacity and knowledge, which we hope to help with and transfer some of that knowledge. Financial incentives for groups and landowners as well, including carbon markets. Those have to be widely available and balanced well with existing timber markets to make these sorts of treatments viable for restoration applications on private land. Also, the cost of layout and implementation. I don't have a magic bullet to this, but careful layout on this is really critical to making this work well. And then a lot of these are going to be familiar. Things that you should ask your practitioner about, like how harvesting is going to impact climate resilience and carbon storage on your woodlot. Because in order to participate in the carbon market, you've got to have carbon in your forest, standing. Have features like vernal pools, dead standing trees, and all of these things are going to be considered for biodiversity reasons as well, if that's important. How do they consider mitigating risks? To the other point, buffers on stand edges, trails that work with the topography. If you're in a high wind risk area, you want to meander your trail so that you're not creating wind tunnel effects. Some of you will remember visiting the Woodlot Owner of the Year field day in Moose River a year and a half ago. And that was the commercial thinning that my booth was in was right next to the bay in a 50-year-old red spruce stand that got hammered by Hurricane Arthur immediately after it was completed. And very fortunately, because of several mitigating factors, that stand is still looking pretty darn healthy today, including, at least I think, that the trails went along and parallel with the contour lines of that treatment. So what happened when Hurricane Arthur hit is just a few trees on the edges of each stand took in, and the rest of the stand was relatively unaffected. If you want to learn more, we're on all social media platforms, as well as YouTube, and our website has all kinds of available information for this audience, and I encourage you to reach out if you've got any questions or would like more information on our many programs. Thank you.